The night air over Lake Superior was thick, a heavy, damp blanket that tasted of pine and wet iron ore. The sky was a starless void, promising a storm that was already brewing in the west. Lieutenant Cade Walker, a man whose quiet strength seemed carved from the same granite as the cliffs he'd trained on, stood near the bow of the combat rubber raiding craft as it cut through the black water. His eyes, clear and focused, scanned the darkness. "Anything?" His voice was low, barely a whisper over the dual thrum of the outboard motors. Petty Officer Echo Riley, a wiry man with nerves stretched taut as piano wire and fingers that seemed to live on his high-frequency keyboard, shook his head. "Clean sweep, Lieutenant. We're ghosts." "Ghosts are what we want to be," Cade said, adjusting the strap on his rifle. Beside him, Senior Chief Rhino Marcus, a man built like a reinforced door who carried the team's medical kit, gave a slight nod of agreement. Rhino was the team's anchor, a calm presence in the chaos of their world. Their mission was simple on paper. Infiltrate a smuggling vessel, retrieve intelligence, and exfiltrate. They had it. A black Pelican hard case, now cuffed to Cade Walker's wrist, held data that could prevent a domestic terror attack. All that remained was the exfil. The longest 20 miles of their lives. The lake began to change. The long, rolling swells grew shorter, choppier. The promised storm was waking up. Rain began to fall. Not a drizzle, but thick, heavy drops that stung the skin. "Contact!" Echo suddenly yelled, his voice cracking. 2, maybe 3 fast movers approaching starboard. "No running lights, sir. They look professional." Cade didn't hesitate. "Rhino, on the 50. Echo, try to jam them. I've got the bow." The night exploded. The enemy boats, sleek and black as lake predators, opened fire. Green tracers cut through the rain-soaked air. Cade returned fire, the sharp crack of his rifle lost in the rising wind. He felt rounds ricochet off their hull. They were outgunned and terrifyingly exposed. "They're faster than us, Skipper," Rhino yelled, his heavy machine gun barking in steady bursts. "They're trying to box us in." Cade saw it, too. A pincer movement. This wasn't some random encounter. It was a calculated ambush. They knew. They knew what he was carrying. He saw the muzzle flash from the lead boat. It wasn't a bullet. RPG. He screamed a warning, diving for the deck. The world dissolved into white light and a deafening roar. The explosion tore through the engine compartment, the force throwing Cade backward like a rag doll. He slammed into a bulkhead, a sharp, searing fire igniting in his side. He looked down. Dark blood was already soaking through his combat suit. The boat was dying, listing hard to port. Rhino was slumped over his weapon. "Rhino!" Cade crawled, his side screaming in protest. He reached his medic, but it was too late. Rhino was gone. "Echo!" Cade yelled, searching for his communications specialist. The deck tilted violently. Echo had been thrown overboard by the initial blast. Cade was alone on a sinking boat, the Pelican case a dead weight on his wrist. Another burst of gunfire ripped through the hull. He had no choice. He grabbed the nearest life vest, punctured, but better than nothing, and forced himself over the side. The cold was the first shock. It was absolute, a physical blow that stole his breath and seized his muscles. The weight of his armor and the case dragged him down into the black depths. He fought, kicking desperately, the fire in his side blooming with every movement. He broke the surface, gasping. The storm had arrived in full. Rain lashed his face, and the waves were huge, black mountains moving in the dark. He saw the burning wreck of his craft 20 yards away. It slipped beneath the waves, taking Rhino with it. "Echo, Rhino!" He screamed, his voice swallowed by the wind. Only the storm answered. He was alone, adrift in hostile water, bleeding heavily with a gale raging around him. He clung to the Pelican case. It was his only flotation, his only anchor to the world. The pain in his side was a constant, dull heat. But the cold was worse. It was insidious, seeping into his bones, draining his will. He began to lose track of time. The world was a chaotic mess of noise, water, and pain. He drifted in the cold. It reminded him of the quarry. He wasn't a Navy lieutenant. He was a 12-year-old boy, standing on the granite ledge of a flooded quarry in Vermont. His little brother, Leo, skinny and brave, was daring him. "Bet you can't swim out to the raft, Cade." He had. He was always the stronger one. But on the way back, Leo got a cramp. Cade heard the panic in his brother's cry. He swam back. He tried to grab him, but Cade was just a boy, and the cold water sapped his strength. He wasn't strong enough. He'd watched his brother sink. He'd joined the Navy to be strong. He forged his body and his mind until they were steel, vowing to never again be too weak to protect those who counted on him. And here, he'd failed again. He'd failed Rhino. He'd failed Echo. The weight of that failure was heavier than his gear, colder than the lake. The waves pushed him, battered him. He wasn't swimming anymore, just surviving. He was so tired. The pain was receding, replaced by a creeping numbness. It would be so easy to let go, to stop, to let the black water take him, just like it took Leo. He closed his eyes. The hand cuffed to the case was the only thing keeping him afloat. He drifted in a gray twilight between life and death, unaware of time, unaware of anything but the roar of the water. Then he felt something else, something solid. It was rock, coarse pebbles and gravel scraping against his face. The storm had thrown him. He'd washed ashore. He tried to crawl, fingers digging into the wet ground. He made it a few feet, dragging the heavy case. The effort cost him the last of his strength. He collapsed, half in the surf, half on the shore. The rain still fell, but it seemed lighter, muted by the roar of the waves crashing on the beach. He knew he was badly hurt. The cold was setting in deep. This was it. He'd survived the enemy, only to die alone on some deserted stretch of coastline. He closed his eyes, the image of Leo's face flashing in his mind. A sound cut through the howl of the wind and the crash of the surf. It was a bark, deep, loud, and insistent. It wasn't a sound of the lake. It was the sound of life. Cade Walker forced his eyelids open. The world was a blur of gray. Standing over him, a dark shape against the dawn, was an animal. It was huge, a magnificent German shepherd, its thick black and tan coat matted to its body from the rain. The dog stood at alert, head cocked, observing him with an almost human intelligence. It wasn't growling. It seemed concerned. Cade tried to move, but managed only a groan. The dog backed up a step, looked up the beach toward a dark tree line, and barked again. It was a deep, resonant sound. It wasn't a bark of aggression. It was a summons. The old wooden shutters of the log cabin rattled, a staccato drumbeat against the howl of the wind. Alara Vance, a woman whose calm exterior hid a deep well of resilience, jolted awake. Her small, isolated home was usually a fortress of silence broken only by the lake and the birds. But this was different. Through the roar of the storm, another sound pierced the night. A sharp, urgent bark. "Ranger," she whispered, sitting up in her simple bed. The German shepherd barked again. That was his alarm bark, not his chasing a chipmunk bark. It was the sound that meant something was wrong. Ellie slid out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cool wooden floorboards. She was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes that had seen too much grief and capable hands accustomed to working soil and sketching pads. She moved with a quiet efficiency, pulling on jeans and a heavy rain slicker. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd lived alone on this remote stretch of Michigan's Upper Peninsula for 2 years, ever since her husband, David, had passed. The outside world, with its noise and its pity, had become too much to bear. This land was her sanctuary. No one ever came here. She took the rifle from its rack over the door. It was David's old Winchester, heavy and smelling faintly of gun oil. She checked the chamber, her hand steady despite the fear. She trusted Ranger's instincts implicitly. He was her guardian, her last living link to her old life. "I'm coming, boy," she called, unlatching the heavy door bar. The wind tore at her, ripping her hair from its loose bun. The rain was a horizontal wall of water, and the lake was a chaotic mass of white foam. She could barely see 10 feet, but she saw Ranger. He was at the edge of the beach, a dark silhouette against the gray, churning waves, barking incessantly at a crumpled shape on the shore. Her first thought was that it was a deer, or maybe a bear, washed up. But as she got closer, the shape resolved into a man. Ellie stopped, her breath catching in her throat. She raised the rifle, the cold, wet stock pressed against her cheek. The man was dressed in tattered, dark tactical gear. He was big, powerfully built, and there was a dark stain spreading across his side. A black hard case was cuffed to his wrist. He was a soldier, or a mercenary, or worse. This was her nightmare, the intrusion she'd always feared. Her finger tightened on the trigger. He wasn't moving. "Ranger, back," she commanded, her voice taut. Ranger ignored her. The big dog trotted from the man to her and back again, whining. He wasn't barking at the man. He was barking at Ellie. He nudged the man's still hand with his nose, licked his face, then looked back at Ellie, his intelligent eyes pleading. He let out a low, mournful sound that cut through the storm. Ellie froze. Ranger was the most protective creature she'd ever known. He would have torn apart anyone who threatened her. And yet here he was, acting as this stranger's guardian. He was asking for help. She lowered the rifle slightly, her eyes locked on the man. He was barely conscious, his face a deathly pallor under the grit and grime. He groaned, a low sound of profound agony. Her fear warred with her compassion. He was a threat. He was a violation of her sanctuary. He was everything she had run from. He was also a human being, bleeding to death on her beach. The lake roared, and a large wave surged up the shore, washing over the man's legs. He didn't even flinch. The water level was rising fast with the storm surge. Oh, God, she breathed. She couldn't. She couldn't just let the lake take him. Not like this. All right, Ranger. All right. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and ran forward, her boots sinking into the wet gravel. She knelt beside the man, her hands hovering, unsure where to touch. Sir, can you hear me? His eyes fluttered open, just a slit. They were blue, but clouded with pain and confusion. He tried to say something, but it came out as a cough, and a fresh slick of blood appeared on his lips. He was dying. We have to move you, she said, more to herself than to him. The water. She got a grip under his arms. He was impossibly heavy, a dead weight of muscle, gear, and water. She pulled, her heels digging in, gaining only inches. The case on his wrist snagged on a piece of driftwood. Help me, Ranger, she grunted. The dog seemed to understand. He wedged his powerful body against the man's back, pushing and nudging as Ellie pulled. It was a slow, agonizing process. They moved foot by foot. Ellie's muscles screamed. The rain blinded her. The man was a silent weight, his life slipping away with every yard they gained. She focused on one thing, the high water mark, then the dunes, then the path to her cabin. She wasn't a hermit hiding from the world anymore. She was a healer, battling the Great Lake for this man's life. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he was good or bad. She just knew Ranger trusted him, and the lake wanted him. She would not let it have him. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the small, covered porch of her cabin. She was trembling, utterly exhausted, soaked to the bone. With one last, desperate heave, she and Ranger rolled him over the threshold and onto the dry floor. Ellie slammed the door shut, barring it against the storm. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening, broken only by her own ragged gasps and the man's shallow, hitching breaths. He lay on her floor, a piece of the violent world she had tried to escape. His wet gear was making a dark, bloody pool on her clean wooden floors. Ranger lay down beside the stranger's head, chin on his paws, eyes never leaving the man's face. Alara Vance stood over him, the cold rifle still clutched in her hands. The sanctuary had been breached. She had brought the danger inside. She looked at the man, then at her loyal dog, and whispered into the silence, "What have I done?" The storm raged, but inside the small cabin, the world had shrunk to the sound of the man's ragged breathing. Alara Vance stood for a long moment, the door barred behind her, the Winchester still heavy in her hands. The man on her floor was an island of his own, a terrain of pain and violence. He was bleeding out, his soaked gear creating a dark puddle on her floor. The practical part of her, the part that knew how to survive, took over. Fear would have to wait. "Ranger, watch the door," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The dog, her ever-faithful guardian, didn't move from his post near the man's head, but his ears swiveled back, acknowledging her. She set the rifle on its rack and knelt beside the stranger. First, she had to get his wet gear off. It was a struggle. The vest was heavy, held by a complex system of buckles and straps she didn't understand. She found a knife on his belt, a functional, no-nonsense blade, and used it to cut the straps. Peeling the heavy, waterlogged body armor from his torso revealed the wound. Ellie took a sharp breath. She'd seen wounds before. David had been clumsy, and life in the wilderness was unforgiving. But this was different. It was a black, ragged hole in his side, just above his hip. It looked angry and deep. "Okay," she whispered, her voice only trembling slightly. "Okay, one step at a time." She went to her small kitchen, pumping water into a kettle to boil. From a wooden chest, she retrieved her medical kit. It wasn't much: antiseptic wipes, a jar of homemade herbal salve made from comfrey and yarrow, butterfly closures, sterile gauze, and a suture kit she'd bought for emergencies and prayed she'd never have to use. Back at his side, she began the grim work of cleaning the wound. As she worked, her hand brushed against his. His skin was fever hot, but his hands were large and strong, even in unconsciousness. On her own left hand, Her simple gold wedding band suddenly felt heavy. She paused, her vision blurring. She remembered sitting just like this on this very floor, holding David's hand. She'd spent 2 years nursing him, watching the vibrant man she loved get slowly stolen away by a vicious, invisible enemy. She had fought for him, using these same hands, trying to heal what couldn't be healed. She had lost. She looked back at the stranger. He was fighting, too. His body was tense, his breath short and pained. She saw the same stubborn spark, the same simple refusal to let go. "No," she said, her voice finding a new, hard strength. "I'm not losing another one. Not in my house." Her sanctuary was breached, but she would be the one who decided what happened here, not fate and not the lake. She cleaned the wound as best she could. There was no bullet. It must have passed through, or maybe it was still lodged deep inside where she couldn't reach. She packed the wound with her strongest salve and applied a thick pressure bandage, wrapping it tightly around his torso. The last piece of gear was the hard case cuff to his wrist. The metal was cold and unyielding. She couldn't remove it, and she didn't try. She just gently moved it aside, covering him with a thick, dry wool blanket. For the next few hours, there was nothing to do but wait. The storm howled. Ranger didn't move. Ellie sat in her rocking chair, the Winchester now resting across her lap, watching the man as the fever took hold. He started to shiver, a violent, rattling chill that the blanket couldn't touch. Then came the delirium. He wasn't on her floor anymore. He was back in the black water. "Rhino! Rhino! Man down!" he yelled, his voice raw and choked. He tried to sit up, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Where's Echo? Gotta go back." Ellie was at his side in an instant, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "Shh," she said, dipping a cloth in cool water and placing it on his forehead. "You're safe. You're on land." "No, left them. I left them," he moaned. The words were a torrent of grief. "My fault, my call, Leo. I couldn't hold on." Ellie froze. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a mercenary come to do her harm. He was a soldier, a leader, and he was grieving. He was lost in a nightmare of failure, calling out for men she would never know, and a name, Leo, that he spoke with the same shattered grief she reserved for David. Her fear of him evaporated, replaced by a wave of deep, aching empathy. He was just a man, torn apart by duty and loss. She sat with him through the night, changing the cloth, whispering calm words he couldn't hear, and standing watch over his sleep. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the shutters, Ellie was exhausted. Her eyes burned. She looked at Ranger. The dog's eyes were locked on hers. "You watch him, boy," she whispered. "I have to rest a minute." She slumped in the chair, her hand still on the rifle, and fell into a shallow, fitful sleep. An hour later, Cade Walker's eyes opened. The fever had broken, leaving him weak, disoriented, and in immense pain. The world was a spinning blur. He didn't know where he was. It wasn't the boat. It was wood, a roof. He smelled wood smoke and yarrow. He tried to move. A white-hot fire in his side stole his breath and he fell back with a groan. A low sound came from beside him. A soft huff. Cade turned his head slowly, his vision focusing. A dog. A massive German shepherd was lying less than a yard away, watching him with calm, intelligent eyes. Cade's training kicked in. His hand instinctively went to his side for a weapon, but found only a thick bandage. He was unarmed. The dog didn't growl. It didn't bare its teeth. It simply observed. Cade had worked with K9 units. He knew these dogs. He saw the discipline in its posture, the intelligence in its gaze. This wasn't some stray. This was a soldier in its own right. He licked his dry, cracked lips. He made no sudden moves. Instead, he made a small, quiet sound, a soft T-click with his tongue. It was a sound of acknowledgement, not command. The dog's ears twitched. "Easy, boy," Cade whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Stay." The dog huffed again softly as if to say, "I see you." Then slowly, Ranger got to his feet, walked the few steps to the cot, and nudged Cade's still, outstretched hand with his cold, wet nose. In that moment, in that strange, warm room, surrounded by the smell of herbs and the sound of a distant, calming rain, Cade Walker knew two things. He wasn't dead, and he wasn't alone. Ellie woke with a start to the silence. The storm had passed. She looked at the cot. The man was awake, and Ranger, her shadow, was standing quietly beside him, accepting a weak scratch behind the ears. The sanctuary had been breached, Yes, but for the first time in 2 years, the weight of her loneliness had lifted. 2 days passed in a strange, suspended quiet. The storm had moved on, leaving the peninsula scrubbed clean, the air crisp and damp. Cade Walker's world was the four walls of Alara Vance's cabin. His fever was gone, but the wound in his side was a constant, burning fire, a brutal reminder of his failure. He spent most of the time drifting in a shallow sleep, the line between fevered nightmares and this strange reality blurring. Ellie was a quiet presence. She moved with a gentle efficiency, bringing him broth that tasted of wild herbs and fresh water from her well. She changed his dressing with a practiced, impersonal touch, her hands smelling faintly of soap and yarrow salve. Ranger, however, was his constant companion. The big shepherd seemed to have adopted Cade as a temporary charge, lying on the floor beside the cot. His presence was a comfort, a solid, living anchor in Cade's sea of pain and confusion. On the third morning, Cade felt a sliver of strength return. He managed to sit up on his own, the movement sending a galaxy of stars across his vision, but he held on, his jaw clenched. Ellie was at her workbench, sketching in a thick, leather-bound notebook. She was a woman who seemed to blend into the room, her clothes practical, her light brown hair pulled back in a simple knot. But as she sketched, her face held a deep concentration that Cade, as a professional observer, found fascinating. "Thank you," he said. His voice was a stranger's, rough from disuse. Ellie looked up, her eyes startled, as if she'd forgotten he could speak. "For what?" "For this. For everything. You saved my life." She gave a short nod, turning back to her drawing. "Ranger found you, and the lake was rising." Cade studied her back. He had to know. "Who are you? Why are you out here alone?" Ellie's hand stilled. She set her pencil down, her shoulders tensing. She turned to face him, her expression guarded. "My name is Alara Vance. This land. It was my husband's, David's. He was a wildlife biologist. He loved this place more than anywhere. He died 2 years ago." Cade saw the flicker of old pain in her eyes, a pain he knew well. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it. "He always said this was his sanctuary," Ellie continued, her voice soft. "After he was gone, the world. It was too loud. I came here to finish his work. To be somewhere he loved." She gestured to the sketches. "He was cataloging the fauna. I'm continuing it for him." "A biologist," Cade said, a small ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That explains the interesting flavor in the soup." A tiny, surprised smile flickered on her face and was gone. "And you? You're a soldier?" It wasn't a question. "Navy," he confirmed, his own walls going up. He wouldn't lie to her, but he couldn't tell her the truth. "My team and I were on a transport. We were ambushed. The storm did the rest. I don't know if," he trailed off, the faces of Rhino and Echo flashing in his mind. "I think I'm the only one." A shared air of loss settled between them. It was a fragile, unspoken bond. He, a man of action, and she, a woman of quiet, both shaped by the people they couldn't save. "I grew up in West Texas," Cade offered, trying to steer the conversation into safer waters. "All flat land and big sky. Nothing like this. You could see a storm coming from 100 miles away. Here, the storms are born right on top of you," Ellie said, glancing out the window. "They come and go before you're ready." She stood, pulling on boots. "I have to go check my equipment. The storm might have damaged it." "Equipment?" Cade felt a prickle of alarm. "Trail cameras," she explained, her voice turning practical again. "For my research, I monitor animal movements on the North Shore. It's part of the catalog." She gave a low whistle. "Come on, Ranger. Let's go." The dog stood, stretched, and looked at Cade. "No," Cade said, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. The room spun and he gripped the wooden frame until his knuckles were white. I can't just stay here. I need to move. I'll go with you." Ellie looked at him as if he were crazy. "You can barely stand. You'll tear the wound open again." "I'm not an invalid," he snapped, frustration sharpening his voice. He pushed himself to his feet. The pain was a white-hot knife and he nearly buckled. He hated this weakness. Hated it. Ellie sighed. She didn't argue. She simply walked over and offered her shoulder. "Lean on me, but only as far as the porch. You need to see the sun. Ranger and I will go on from there. It's too far for you." "Not yet." He swallowed his pride and leaned on her. She was stronger than she looked. Together, they made it to the small porch. The sunlight was brilliant, almost violent. He leaned heavily against the railing, breathing in the clean, pine-scented air. "We'll be back in an hour," Ellie said. She patted his arm awkwardly, then started down the path, Ranger trotting happily at her heels, nose to the ground. Cade watched them go, a profound sense of uselessness washing over him. He was a Navy SEAL, a protector, and he was relying on a civilian biologist just to stand up. The perspective shifts to Ellie and Ranger. The forest was alive with sound, birds calling, squirrels chattering in the canopy. Ellie felt the familiar comfort of her routine settle over her. This was her world, ordered, predictable. Ranger, however, was uneasy. As they neared the north shore, his happy trot slowed. He stopped, head up, ears swiveling. A low, soft rumble vibrated in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ellie whispered, pausing. "Coyotes again?" Ranger ignored her, moving slowly forward, his body low to the ground. He was creeping toward her first trail camera, hidden in a tangle of birch roots. A cold dread trickled down Ellie's spine. She trusted the dog's instincts more than her own. She approached the camera. It seemed undisturbed. She unlatched the weatherproof casing and pulled out the small SD card. She carried a small battery-powered viewer in her pack to check the cards in the field. She plugged it in. The first dozen images were just leaves blown by the storm. The next was a small fisher, sniffing the lens. The next was a raccoon. Then she froze. Her blood ran cold. The picture was time-stamped from yesterday. It wasn't an animal. It was a boot. A black, military-style combat boot planted firmly in the mud. Her thumb trembled as she clicked to the next frame. A man. He was dressed in dark, mercenary-style gear, a rifle slung across his chest. He was looking directly at the camera. The next frame, another man, and another, 3 of them. They were heavily armed and they were sweeping the beach. They were organized. They weren't shipwreck survivors. They were hunting. Ranger let out a single, sharp bark, looking not at the camera, but further down the beach. Ellie didn't hesitate. She ripped the card from the viewer, shoving both into her pack. Ranger, home, now. She didn't take the path. She crashed through the underbrush, vines and branches tearing at her, her heart hammering a deafening rhythm against her ribs. The sanctuary was gone. The peace was a lie. She burst out of the tree line and stumbled onto the porch, nearly falling. Cade was still there, his back to her, looking out at the lake. He turned at the sound, his soldier's reflexes faster than his injured body. "Ellie." She was gasping, pale, holding the tiny SD card up in her shaking hand as if it were a live grenade. "You're not the only one," she panted, her voice choked with terror. "You're not the only one who washed ashore. They're here. They're on the peninsula." Cade's eyes, which had been full of pain and memory, went instantly clear. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus that chilled her to the bone. The patient was gone. "How many?" he asked, his voice flat and lethal. "3, she whispered. "And they're looking for you." The patient was gone. In his place stood the lieutenant. Cade Walker's eyes were no longer clouded with pain. They were clear, sharp, and cold as ice. He pushed himself off the railing, ignoring the brutal protest from the wound in his side. Pain was just a signal, and he was an expert at ignoring signals. "Show me," he said. His voice wasn't the weak rasp of a survivor. It was the quiet, absolute command of a leader. Ellie was still panting, the terror making her shake. "What?" "The pictures. And a map. You have a map of this area?" "A map?" she stammered. "Yes, David's. His research. It's inside." He moved past her into the cabin, his limp pronounced, but his stride steady. He was a different person. The gentle, broken man she had nursed was a shell. This was the soldier, the predator he was trained to be. He went to the small table and waited. Ranger, sensing the shift, stood guard by the door, ears forward, a low growl starting deep in his chest. Ellie fumbled in her pack, her hand shaking so badly she almost dropped the SD card. She handed it to him, then went to a large, flat wooden drawer, one she rarely opened. It was filled with her husband's work. She pulled out a large, hand-drawn map. It was meticulous, covered in notations, contour lines, and quadrants labeled in David's precise handwriting. She spread it on the table. Cade plugged the card into her small digital viewer, his large, scarred hands surprisingly delicate. He studied the images of the 3 armed men. He didn't just look, he analyzed. 3 men, he said, his voice flat. FN scars, professional kit, body armor. These aren't locals. They're my welcome party. He looked up from the viewer, his gaze locking with hers. They're here for this. He tapped the pelican case, still cuffed to his wrist, and they won't leave without it, or my head. Ellie's blood ran cold. What do we do? We have to hide. Hiding only works if they aren't looking. They're looking, Cade said. He turned his full attention to the map. This is your world, Ellie, not mine. Talk to me. Where did you see them? Ellie felt a strange calm settle over her. His focus was infectious. She was no longer just a frightened widow. She was the expert in the room. She pointed to a spot on the northern coastline. Here, my camera was here. They were moving west along the shore. Toward us, Cade said. They're sweeping the coastline. They'll find this cabin before dark. Maybe sooner. His eyes scanned the map. What's this? He pointed to an area marked with crosshatching. A cedar swamp, Ellie said. It's impassable. Quicksand, thick brush. David always said to stay clear. Good, Cade said. That protects our flank. And here? He tapped a high point on the central spine of the peninsula. Eagle's Point. It's the highest spot. You can see the whole bay from there, but it's a hard climb. Defensible, Cade muttered. High ground is life. He looked at her. We aren't hiding, Ellie. We're moving. We're moving to Eagle's Point. But first, what's our arsenal? Ellie looked around the small cabin, seeing it through his eyes. It wasn't a home. It was a box.
I have the Winchester, the one I had on the beach, and
a flare gun for emergencies. Get them. She took the heavy rifle from its rack and the bright orange flare gun from her emergency kit. Cade took the rifle, his hands moving over it with a professional familiarity. He checked the action, the scope. Winchester Model 70.30206, he said, a flicker of respect in his eyes. David had good taste. How much ammo? 2 boxes, Ellie said. In the drawer. Get it. And the flare gun. He picked up the plastic pistol. This is good. Very good. It's not a weapon. It's a signal. Or a diversion. He saw her hatchet, the one she used for clearing brush. He tested its weight. This, too. He looked at his own pile of gear in the corner. His rifle was gone, swallowed by the lake. His body armor was ruined. All he had was his knife, the case on his wrist, and his training. Okay, he said quietly. He handed the Winchester back to her. Ellie looked at the heavy rifle, then at him. I've used it for target practice. Sometimes a wild hog for food. A hog doesn't shoot back, Cade said. He stood in front of her. Hold it. No, not like that. Bring the stock up higher, tight into your shoulder. Don't fight the recoil. Become part of it. He adjusted her stance. His touch was impersonal. Pure instructor. Breathe out slow. Squeeze the trigger. Don't jerk it. Surprise yourself. You have 40 rounds. That means you have 40 chances. You can't waste one. Ellie looked down the barrel, her heart hammering. This was David's rifle. It was for research, for protection from nature. And this man was teaching her how to point it at another human being. The healer in her recoiled, but the survivor, the woman who had fought the lake for this man's life, nodded. I understand, she said. Good, Cade said. He turned back to the map. Now it's your turn. They'll follow our trail from this cabin. I can't move fast. I need an edge. Ellie's mind went to her work. She looked at the map. At her husband's notes. An edge? She repeated. She pointed to a section of the trail leading up to the peak. Here. The trail narrows. It's the only way up there unless you want to rock climb. And it's covered in wild raspberry thickets. Raspberry what? They're thorny vines, Ellie said, her confidence growing. We call them devil's hair. The thorns are like fish hooks, and the canes are woody and tough as wire. If you get tangled in it, you don't get out easy. I've used the hatchet to keep the path clear. A slow, grim smile spread across Cade's face. It was the first time she'd seen him smile, and it was terrifying. Devil's hair, he said. Show me how to set a trap. A big one. For the next hour, they became a team, the soldier and the healer, their roles reversed and blended. He taught her the cold geometry of a firefight. She taught him the living dangers of the forest. They packed the essentials, water canteens, the rest of her dried fruit and jerky, the first aid kit, and all the ammunition. Cade, wincing, strapped his knife to his belt. Ellie packed the flare gun and her hatchet. As they stood by the door, ready to leave, the reality hit Ellie. She was leaving her home, her sanctuary, the last place she had been with David. She was walking into the woods to be hunted. Her breath caught. Cade, we can't do this, she whispered, the fear returning. They're professionals. You're wounded. I'm a biologist. We should find a cave and hide. Cade stopped, his hand on the door. He turned to face her. The cold, hard mask of the soldier softened for a moment. He saw her terror, and he recognized it. They won't stop hunting, Ellie. Ever. They know I'm alive, and now they know I'm not alone. You're a witness. There's no hiding from men like that. He saw her hand trembling on the rifle. I will get you through this. I will protect you. I swear on my life. It was a warrior's promise, absolute and final. Ellie looked at him. At the dark stain spreading on his bandage, at the exhaustion he was holding back with sheer will. She thought of her promise to herself. I'm not losing another one. She took a deep breath, and her hand on the rifle stilled. Her fear was still there, but it was no longer in the driver's seat. Determination had taken its place. No, she said, her voice quiet but strong. You're still hurt. That wound is bleeding again. You can't do this alone. You need my knowledge of this land and you need this rifle. She looked him straight in the eye, not as a victim, but as a partner. You'll protect me, and I'll protect you. We'll protect each other. Cade Walker looked at this civilian woman, this healer who had just accepted the reality of war. He saw her strength, and he nodded. All right, Ellie. All right, let's go. He opened the door. Ranger slipped out ahead, a silent scout. Cade and Ellie followed, leaving the empty cabin behind. They didn't look back. They melted into the green, watchful silence of the forest, leaving their sanctuary to the predators. 3 men emerged from the woods, moving with the fluid, silent economy of professionals. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their rifles held low, scanning the cabin. The lead man, Silas, was of average height with a lean, wiry build and the dead, calm eyes of a man who has seen everything. He was a tracker, an apex predator in human form. He held up a hand, and his 2 men, Brick, a massive breacher, and Cody, a young, nervous-looking calm specialist, fanned out to cover the flanks. Silas approached the cabin slowly. He noted the porch, the deep boot prints near the railing where a man had leaned heavily. He pushed the door. It was unlocked. He entered, rifle up, sweeping the small room. Empty. Clear, Brick grunted, entering behind him. Cody remained on the porch, his radio crackling softly. Silas didn't answer. He was reading the room. He went to the cot, saw the wool blanket hastily folded at its end. He touched the pillow. It was damp. He smelled the air. Wood smoke, salt, and something else. Yarrow. He went to the small table where a medical kit lay open. He saw empty antiseptic white packets, bloody gauze, the small empty jar of herbal salve. He was here, Silas said, his voice a low, evaluative rumble. He's hurt bad, fever. He looked down at the floor, noting a single, faint, bloody boot print near the cot and smaller, cleaner prints beside it. And he's got help. A woman? Brick spat. On this rock? What are the odds? She's a liability to him, Silas said. He scanned the room again, his eyes missing nothing. The map drawer slightly ajar. The empty rifle rack. 2 empty boxes of .32-06 ammunition. She's armed. He turned to Cody. They're on the move. He's wounded. She's a civilian. They won't get far. Find their trail. Wait, Brick said, stooping near the workbench. Look at this. She dropped it. He held up the small black digital viewer Ellie had used for her trail camera. Silas took it from him. He switched it on. He clicked through the images, the leaves, the raccoon, the fisher, and then his own team. He looked at the timestamp. She saw us yesterday. He looked toward the door. They have an hour's head start, maybe less. They know we're here. He's a soldier. He'll go for high ground. Eagle's Point. He tossed the viewer back to Brick. Forget the trail. We know where they're going. We'll cut them off. Let's move. Miles away, the forest had become a green prison. The air was a thick, humid blanket, so dense that every breath was an effort. Cade Walker was moving on pure will. The fire in his side had become a blinding, white-hot sheet of pain. He knew the wound was bleeding again. He could feel the warm wetness seeping through the fresh bandage Ellie had applied. He hated this. Hated being the weak link. Hated that every pained breath, every stumble, was a liability that could get this woman killed. Ellie, however, was in her element. Her fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but the forest was her home. She moved with a confidence that impressed him, her eyes constantly scanning, not for people, but for terrain. This way, she'd whisper, pulling him away from a patch of bright, inviting ground cover. That's poison sumac. The oils. They'll burn your skin right off. Cade nodded, leaning heavily on a walking stick she'd cut for him. A healer's knowledge is a weapon, too, he gasped. They came to a narrow pass, the trail climbing steeply with sheer rock on one side and a deep, vine-choked ravine on the other. This is it, Ellie said. This is the trail. The devil's hair. Good, Cade said, breathing hard. Give me the hatchet. For 10 minutes, they worked. Cade, his face pale and beaded with sweat, directed her. No, not there. Pull it taut. We want it chest high. When they come through, they won't be looking up. They'll be looking down at the trail. They pulled the thick, woody canes covered in thorns like vicious, curved fishhooks across the path, weaving them into a nearly invisible net. It wasn't a killing trap. It was an entanglement trap, meant to slow, to create a messy, deadly delay. It's done, Ellie said, her hands bleeding from the thorns. All right, we keep climbing, Cade said. We're losing the light. They pushed on, the incline becoming steeper. The forest canopy was so thick it was impossible to see more than 20 yards in any direction. They were climbing blind. Cade stopped, holding up a hand. He leaned against a tree, the pain making him dizzy. I can't hear them, he whispered. I don't know where they are. He looked at Ranger. The dog was standing alert, his body rigid, his nose testing the wind. Cade reached out, placing a hand on the dog's powerful head. He looked into those intelligent, loyal eyes. Ranger, he said, his voice low and firm, watch. Watch our six. He gave a slight push on the dog's rump, a silent K9 command. Go watch. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't hesitate. He simply vanished. He became a ghost, melting into the undergrowth, moving back down the trail without making a sound. Ellie held her breath. What did you? He's trained, Cade whispered, sinking to one knee. Just like me. He's a scout. Now we wait. Be quiet. The silence of the forest was absolute. No wind, no birds, just the drip of water from leaves and the sound of Ellie's own heart hammering. It felt like an eternity. Then a flicker of movement. Ranger reappeared. He wasn't the happy, trotting companion. This was a professional. He stood 20 yards away, looked directly at Cade, and gave a single, low huff. A small, suppressed bark. He did it twice. Cade's blood ran cold. 2? No, he whispered. That's not 2 men. That's danger close. They're on us. They're moving fast. They must have found another way up. They're past the trap. He grabbed Ellie's arm, pulling her up. Go, Ellie. Go as fast as you can. Go. They weren't climbing anymore. They were scrambling. The path was slick mud covered in treacherous roots. Cade pushed Ellie ahead of him, his own vision starting to tunnel. The blood loss was making him weak. Don't stop, Ellie, he yelled, his voice raw. Whatever you hear, don't stop. Get to the summit. Ellie was crying, her lungs burning, the terror giving her a strength she didn't know she had. She glanced back for a split second to see if he was following. It was a fatal hesitation, her foot catching on a gnarled root. She didn't just stumble, she fell. She cried out as she tumbled sideways, down a short, steep embankment. She slammed into a curtain of vines, dislodging a small avalanche of dirt and pebbles that rattled down into the ravine below. The Winchester, her only real weapon, flew from her grasp. Silence. Then a voice, shockingly close from the ravine just below them. There, up top, I heard him. It was Cody. A single shot cracked through the forest. The sound was deafening. A bullet slammed into the tree trunk right where Ellie's head had been a second before, blasting a spray of bark and splinters into her hair. She screamed. Cade didn't think, he acted. He launched himself down the embankment, a wave of darkness and pain exploding behind his eyes. He landed beside her, one hand grabbing the fallen rifle, the other encircling her waist. Crawl, he snarled, his voice a seal's bark. He shoved her up the muddy slope. Another shot. This one chipped the rock near his head. Ranger was barking. A deep, furious roar, diverting their attention, drawing their fire. Cade gave Ellie one last shove over the lip of the summit and behind a massive granite boulder. He scrambled after her, his body spent. They collapsed behind the rock. They were safe for a moment. The shooting stopped. Are you okay? Ellie gasped, her voice trembling. Cade didn't answer. He slumped against the cold rock, his breath shallow and ragged. Cade. She touched his shoulder. He looked at her, his eyes struggling to focus. He tried to speak. Then he looked down. Ellie followed his gaze. The front of his shirt, all the way down to his belt, was soaked in a dark, glistening crimson. The fall, the desperate scramble. It had torn the wound wide open. He wasn't just bleeding. He was hemorrhaging. The world had shrunk to the space behind the granite boulder. Below them, the forest was a sea of green. Behind them, a sheer 500-foot drop to the rocks below. There was no escape. Cade Walker slumped against the cold rock, his back to the cliff face. The world was going gray at the edges. He pressed a hand hard against the wound in his side, but he could feel his life pouring out of him, warm and wet over his fingers. "Ellie," he said, his voice a raw whisper. He pushed the heavy Winchester rifle into her hands. "Ellie, look at me." She was shaking, her eyes wide with horror, fixed on the spreading crimson stain on his uniform. "Cade, you're... Oh, God. You're... No time." He cut her off, his voice as hard as the rock he leaned against. He was right. "I'm the weak link. You're not. You're the shooter. I'm the spotter. Do you understand?"
I can't."
"Yes, you can." He gripped her hand, his fingers digging in with surprising strength. "You pulled me from the lake. You can do this. 2 men are coming. The heavy one, Brick. He's a breacher. All aggression. The other one, Cody, he's young. He'll... Be cautious." Cade listened, head cocked, his training cutting through the fog of pain. He heard the scrape of a boot on rock. "They're coming. Wait for the young one. He'll expose himself first. Aim for center mass. Squeeze. Don't jerk. Breathe out." Ellie got to her knees, resting the heavy barrel of the Winchester on the boulder. Her entire body was trembling. She could barely see through the scope. "They're on us." A voice shouted from below. "It's Cody." The young, nervous-looking man, Cody, stepped out from behind a tree, raising his rifle. "Now, Ellie," Cade commanded. Ellie squeezed her eyes shut and pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked into her shoulder, the sound a deafening crack that echoed through the valley. Cody went down. He didn't make a sound. "Good girl." Cade gasped, but the big man, Brick, was moving. Enraged at seeing his teammate fall, he broke from the trees, charging up the trail, his rifle firing wildly. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the granite, sending chips of rock flying through the air. Ellie cried out and ducked, dropping the rifle. Cade, knowing she was pinned, did the only thing he could. He drew the pistol from his thigh holster, the one weapon he'd managed to keep. He was on his back, his vision tunneling. He extended his arm, using his bloody left hand to steady his firing hand. He waited. Brick was a charging bull, reckless. Cade fired twice, 2 controlled, professional shots. The big man stumbled, his rifle clattering on the rocks, and collapsed 20 yards from their position. Silence. The ringing in Ellie's ears was deafening. We did it," she whispered, her voice shaking with shock. They're gone." Cade was shaking his head, trying to clear the black spots from his vision. "No," he gasped. "The leader, the tracker, Silas, he wasn't with them. He's flanking. He's..." A hand shot out from the side, grabbing Ellie's hair. She was yanked from behind the rock with a choked scream. Silas. He had climbed the last 20 feet of the cliff face, silent as a snake. He was on them. He pressed a long, wicked-looking combat knife to her throat. He looked at Cade, his eyes as cold and dead as the lake. "It's over, Lieutenant," Silas said, his voice calm, almost polite. He pulled Ellie tighter, using her as a perfect shield. "The case. Unlock it. Give it to me." Cade tried to raise his pistol, but his arm was too heavy. It dropped to his side. He was helpless. "Let her go," Cade gasped. "She's a civilian. She saw nothing. She saw me, and she's the only reason you're still breathing." Silas pressed the blade, and a thin line of blood welled on Ellie's neck. "The case, or she dies first, then you." Cade looked at the man holding the woman who had saved him. He thought of Rhino. He thought of Echo. He thought of Leo. The familiar, icy despair of failure washed over him. He was too weak again. "Go on," Cade whispered, his life fading. "Do it." "No," Ellie screamed. Just as Silas shifted his grip on Ellie, preparing to finish Cade and take the case, a black and tan missile exploded from behind the boulder. Ranger. He'd been silent, waiting. He didn't go for the knife arm, but for the arm Silas was using to hold Ellie. His jaws locked onto the mercenary's forearm, his growl a deep, powerful sound of pure, protective rage. Silas screamed, a sound of surprise and fury. His hold on Ellie broke as the dog's weight and power slammed into him. It was an opening, but Cade couldn't take it. Silas shoved Ellie to the ground. He turned, leveling his own pistol at the dog still attached to his arm. He fired once, twice. The sounds were flat and brutal. Ranger's powerful jaws went slack. He gave a single, confused yelp of pain, and collapsed on the rocks, his body still. The world stopped. Ellie, on her knees, saw her protector, her companion, her last link to David, fall. The horror that had frozen her shattered, and it was replaced by something else. A white-hot, blinding rage. Silas brought his gun around toward Cade, who was slumped and dying. "Stupid dog," he spat. "No!" Ellie screamed. As Silas's finger tightened on the trigger, Ellie lunged. She didn't go for the rifle. She grabbed the flare gun, still tucked in her belt. She jammed it into the side of Silas's neck and pulled the trigger. There was a cannon-like thump, a blinding flash of chemical red. The flare ignited, embedding itself in the man's neck and shoulder. Silas shrieked, a sound that wasn't human. He dropped his pistol, both hands flying to his face and neck, now covered in burning magnesium. He staggered backward, blinded, screaming, slapping at the fire that was consuming him. He was still a threat. He was still armed. Cade Walker saw it, his one last chance. The redemption he'd been looking for since he was 12. He used the last ounce of strength in his body. He roared, a sound of pure, primal will, and launched himself off the ground. He didn't tackle the man. He pushed. He slammed into the burning, blinded mercenary's chest with all his remaining body weight. Silas was already off balance, staggering back, his boots scuffing the edge of the cliff. Cade's shove was enough. The mercenary's arms windmilled. His scream was cut short as he disappeared over the edge of Eagle's Point. He vanished into the green abyss, leaving only the smell of smoke and a ringing silence. Cade collapsed. The fight was over. The enemy was gone. He looked at Ellie, who was staring at the cliff's edge, her face a mask of shock. Then his eyes went to the still, dark shape on the rocks. "Ranger," he whispered. He tried to crawl toward the dog. He couldn't. The gray fog was turning to black. He collapsed, hand outstretched, his life spilling out onto the cold rock just inches from his fallen, four-legged guardian. The silence on Eagle's Point was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind over granite. Alara Vance knelt, her ears ringing, her mind numb. She was frozen between 3 points of impossible reality. The lingering, acrid smell of the fallen man, the still, silent shape of her dog, and the black pool of Cade Walker's blood staining the rocks. It was the blackness of the blood that broke her shock. She remembered David. She remembered the slow, inevitable fade, the feeling of complete helplessness. "No," she whispered. The whisper became a raw, broken sob. "No, I will not." She scrambled to Cade. He was unconscious, his breathing terrifyingly shallow. The wound, torn open by his final act of heroism, was no longer seeping. It was pumping. She ripped the first aid kit from her pack. It was nearly empty. "Don't you dare," she commanded him, her voice fierce, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare leave me. Not you. Not after this." She grabbed the last of the sterile pads and the roll of tape. It wasn't enough. She tore a long strip from the bottom of her own shirt, wadded it up, and shoved it into the wound, pushing with all her strength. Cade's body arched in a silent scream of agony. But he didn't wake. She pressed down, her hands, her arms, her whole body shaking as she fought to stop the bleeding. A low, heartbroken moan cut through her panic. "Ranger," she looked over. Her dog, her protector, was trying to lift his head. His back leg was splayed out and his shoulder was a mess of blood and torn fur. He moaned again, his tail giving a single, weak thump on the rock. He was alive. Her heart broke. Triage, the soldier's word. She had to choose. Cade's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound. He was drowning. She looked at Ranger, who was watching her, his brown eyes filled with a pain and trust that shattered her. She couldn't choose. She wouldn't. "Hang on, Cade," she snarled, putting all her weight on the bandage. "Just hang on." With one hand still pressed to Cade's side, she used the other to drag herself inch by inch toward her dog. She reached him, her arm stretched to its limit. "Oh, my boy," she wept, her fingers finding the wound. "My brave boy." The bullets had passed through the thick muscle of his shoulder. Bad, but not fatal. Not if she could stop the bleeding. She looked at Cade. His color was as gray as the rock. He was failing. She looked at Ranger, who licked her hand. She was losing them both. The radio. Cade's eyes flickered open. He was barely there. A ghost. Cody, he whispered, his voice a thread. Comms guy's radio. He was right. Their only hope. I can't leave you, Ellie cried, her hand slipping in his blood. Have to, he gasped. Or we all die. She looked at Cody, the young mercenary she'd shot, lying 20 yards down the trail. It felt like a mile. She looked at Cade, then at Ranger. She made her decision. I'll be right back, she promised. She shoved the Winchester into Cade's limp hand. To Ranger she said, watch him. She ran. She scrambled down the path, her feet slipping in the mud. She reached Cody. She didn't look at his face. She found the radio on his vest, tore it free, and ran back. She knelt between her two patients, the radio in her trembling hand. Cade. Cade. How? He was fading. Green button, he rasped. Channel 2. Squeeze and talk. Mayday. Mayday. Ellie squeezed the button. Mayday. Mayday. This is Alara Vance. I'm on Eagles Point. I have a wounded officer, a Navy officer. He's hit. We need help. Please, God, somebody help us. Static answered. She tried again, and again. On the fourth try, a voice, small and crackling, came through. Receiving Mayday. State your location. Eagles Point, she yelled. David's map coordinates. Cade. The coordinates. Cade was almost gone. He fumbled with the case on his wrist. My tracker. It's active. They know. He closed his eyes. Tell them. Broken arrow. He says broken arrow, she yelled into the radio. He's dying. Please hurry. The radio crackled. Copy that. Ma'am, stay put. Help is coming fast. ETA, 2 hours. Hang on. 2 hours. An eternity. Ellie dropped the radio. The firefight was over, but the battle for their lives had just begun. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Night would bring the cold, and the cold would bring death. Okay, Ellie said to the sky. She went to work. She moved with a grim, focused energy she didn't know she possessed. She tore more strips from her shirt, from Cade's own tattered uniform, and fashioned a new, massive pressure bandage for his side. She propped his legs up on a rock to slow the blood loss. Then she turned to Ranger. She cleaned his wound as best she could with water from her canteen. She packed it with the last of her yarrow salve, David's healing gift, and bound it tightly. She broke a branch off a sapling, splinting his leg to keep him from moving it. She sat between them, a guard against the encroaching dark. When Cade shivered, she covered him with her slicker. When Ranger whimpered, she whispered to him, her hand on his head. She was the healer. She was the sentry. She held the line against the night, one woman on a rock, refusing to let death take her family. Dawn came not as a gentle light, but as a cold, gray promise. Ellie was exhausted, her arms and back screaming, her hands filthy and stiff. But she'd done it. Cade was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. Ranger was sleeping, his breathing steady. Then she heard it, a sound from her old life. A heavy, rhythmic whump 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 that grew louder, vibrating through the very air. A massive, gray Coast Guard helicopter, a Jayhawk, crested the peak. It hovered, its rotor wash blasting her, then settled onto the only flat piece of ground 50 yards away. The sliding door opened. 3 men in uniform, medics, jumped out, running toward them. Ma'am, the lead medic, a young man with calm eyes, yelled over the rotors. Are you Alara Vance? He's, she stammered, pointing. We see him, ma'am. They were on Cade in a second, their hands sure and practiced, cutting away her bandages, applying field dressings, starting in 4. You did good, ma'am. You saved his life. As they were moving Cade onto a backboard, he stirred. His pain-clouded eyes found hers. Ranger, he whispered. Take the dog, too. The lead medic yelled to his partner. The second medic, who had a K9 patch on his sleeve, knelt beside Ranger. He ran his hands over the dog's wound. Clean through and through, he said. He's tough. He'll be a hero back at base. Let's get him. They gently lifted Ranger onto a small, folding litter. They were loading Cade into the helicopter. He was stabilized, but weak. He motioned for Ellie to come closer. She bent down, the rotor wash whipping her hair. Ellie, he said, his voice barely audible. He fumbled at his chest, his fingers too weak. The lead medic understood, unpinning the gold trident insignia from his own uniform and placing it in Cade's hand. Cade pushed it into her palm. "I owe you everything." Ellie looked at the small, sharp piece of metal, the symbol of his entire world. She thought of her sanctuary, of David, of the violence. She closed his fingers back around it. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong over the noise. "You don't owe me. You owe him." She nodded toward Ranger, who was being loaded beside him. "You two saved each other. All of us." She lightly touched the bandage on his side, right where her hands had been all night. "Live, Cade Walker. Live a good life. That's the only payment." A medic tapped her shoulder. "Ma'am, we have to go." She stepped back. The sliding door closed. The turbines whined and the huge machine lifted off. The rotor wash nearly knocked her over. Alara Vance stood alone on the summit. Her clothes were torn and filthy, her hands were raw. She watched the helicopter disappear into the clear morning sky. A gray bird carrying away 2 souls she had won back from the lake and the mountain. She looked out over her empty, quiet peninsula. The sanctuary had been breached. The silence had been broken. But as she stood there, the sun warming her face, she didn't feel fear. She didn't feel alone. She felt strong. She knew with the same certainty that she knew the tides that the soldier and his dog would be back. It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning.